Hello, my name is Mark Taylor and welcome to the Education on Fire podcast. The place for creative and inspiring learning from around the world. Listen to teachers, parents and mentors share how they are supporting children to live their best authentic life and are proving to be a guiding light to us all. Hello, welcome back to the Education on Fire podcast. Thank you so much for deciding to spend some time with us here today. If you haven't already, please do hit subscribe on whichever platform you're using to listen, and that way the latest episodes get downloaded straight to your device of choice. Now, very often on the podcast, we talk about a change in the curriculum, a way of doing things differently, and today I'm really excited to talk to Conrad Wolfram. And Conrad is a leading advocate for a fundamental shift in math education to become computer-based or alternatively introduce a new core subject of computational thinking. He founded computer-based-math.org and computational-thinking.org to fundamentally fix maths education for the AI age. The movement is now a worldwide force in re-engineering the STEM curriculum. His groundbreaking book, The Maths Fix, an educational blueprint for the AI age, was released on the 10th of June 2020. Now, just before this fantastic conversation, here's a quick thank you to our sponsor. I'd like to thank the National Association for Primary Education for their continued support and sponsorship of the Education on Fire podcast. In March, they have a brand new conference which is online called Towards the Balanced and Broadly Based Curriculum. Now, the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on children's education may be perceived as a justification for narrowing the curriculum at the expense of the arts and the humanities. But this conference will explore the case for preserving young children's entitlement to as rich and diverse a curriculum as possible. Dr. Yude's keynote lecture will set the scene, highlighting some key issues and considering some lessons to be learnt from the period of lockdown. The subsequent presentations will focus on classroom practice, providing a spotlight on innovations which have been implemented in school and offering guidance for the future. Now, to find out more about this conference, please go to nape.org.uk/conference. That's nape.org.uk/conference. Hello, Conrad. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Education on Fire podcast.
It's great to be here.
So this I'm very excited about because one of the things I talk about so much on the podcast is how we create the environment that we need in order to learn. And I think that comes from it being purposeful in terms of being fit for purpose, in terms of how our education system is set. And then beyond that, if we don't feel that's the case, how we can do it as individuals. So having watched your TED Talk, having thought about exactly what it is that we're doing, especially maths was in school, then it always seemed to me that it was one step removed from certainly what children are interested in, but also at the same time what industry was saying they wanted as well. So let's start exactly with that question. What is maths for, and how do we go about using that within the school system?
So out in the real world, the right maths, and we'll come back to that, is really has been driving, progress in the world particularly hard for the last 50 plus years. It's the thing that underlies the fantastic engineering we have, the smartphones, the way we communicate. It's the underlying, in a sense, human endeavor that has allowed us to build all of these great technologies. And of course, one of the biggest sort of underlying technologies there are computers, which themselves were a product to some extent of mathematics. Alan Turing, who was the great mathematician who you could say invented computers. That was never down to one person, but he was the closest I think one could say to break the Enigma codes in the Second World War, and of course was a mathematician himself, British, and he invented the computer in effect, which was a machine built out of mathematics. And so one of the amazing aspects of our education at the moment is that for a country where we essentially have the inventor of the computer who was a mathematician, we more or less ban computers out of learning, out of the subject of mathematics in schools, and therefore rather remove that subject from the one I've just been describing in the outside world. And this year particularly, maths has been absolutely in the forefront in the real world because of trying to figure out what to do about COVID-19. I'm not actually very happy with all of how it's been used. That's a separate conversation. But the idea that our lives are dependent completely in the outside world and what mathematics can do is definitely out there very centrally this year.
And do you think from a school point of view, is it just that I guess the government don't know what to do in order to change, because it does seem to me that, like I said to begin with, industry is asking for a certain type of person to go into the world of work, and even if we take the standpoint that that's all education is for, which I don't believe for a moment, but even if you take that from a sort of a political standpoint, it's still not even delivering on that, is it? So,
No.
Why do you think that might be?
Total confusion is the number one reason, right? And in fact, I go into this in some detail in my book. Even people who are sort of, technically educated, people at universities and technical people in industry, they find it very difficult to put together. They know there's a problem. They know they're not getting the right product, which is a term I hate in terms of students, but just to put it that way. But somehow they can't quite abstract out what the problem is. And so they sort of push for more mathematics, harder mathematics, in the hope that will solve the problem. And then, of course, the government in the middle of this have all sorts of people telling them what to do, and they get even more confused and don't want to do anything too revolutionary. My message is simple at some level, which is, in order to mimic the real world utility of maths, we need computers doing the calculating. And removing them from educational maths is completely removing most of the context that's so critical for our students to learn, most of the complexity of the problems that they need to be able to solve in the outside world, and even changing the tool sets that they need to learn to the point where it's pretty much unrecognizable. I mean, for example, we all have to learn quadratic equation solutions at school. And I've challenged many ministers around the world, including some of our own in the UK, as to when they last used a quadratic equation. It's actually very hard to find somebody. If you're a technical person, you might happen to use one, but you'd solve it on a computer, and it'd probably be a differential equation or many other types of equation. The idea of an equation is a very important idea. Knowing the details of solving the quadratic is a completely different set of skills that, frankly, nobody really uses. I mean, if when the ministers are sharp, they say, "Oh, I last used it to help my kids at school on their homework." But that's hardly a good reason for why everyone should learn it. And yet, there are things now like machine learning, which are used all the time in the outside world. And I think one could introduce some understanding of machine learning to 10-year-olds. There's nothing intrinsically, conceptually hard about the idea of how it works. And there's no reason not to use it. Of course, you need a computer to use it. It can't be done without a computer. And so that's the kind of change you could see in the subject matter. And back to your question of confusion, most people are totally confused about what maths is altogether, why it's there in education, why it's mainstream in education. And a comparison I make quite a lot in the book is about Latin. I mean, whether you like Latin or not, I think forcing the entire population to learn it in order to be allowed to get into a good university doesn't seem like the right thing. Yet that is what happened in the 1950s. In order to go and study, I don't know, science at a good university, you had to have a Latin A level. I think that's a little bit the situation we've currently got with the traditional maths. But there is this subject we really need. But there's total confusion about it. One other aspect of confusion I'll add is people think of computers as a way to assist pedagogy of learning today's subjects. And sure, there are great ways computers can help, though I think teachers are absolutely central as well. That's a fundamentally different use of computers to having them change the subject itself. And so a piece of confusion that really percolates through government is the difference between those two. They say, we are applying computers in maths. And you say, what are you doing? And they say, well, we're helping students learn how to solve their quadratics by hand. And you say, that sounds a bit backwards to me.
That's really interesting. And I think it is that essence, isn't it? I mean, every student, and I don't want to say every student, including primary school, but even probably as low down as kind of reception to year one, will have access to a smartphone, even if it's only for parents, and that kind of thing. And they will be doing calculations, they will be doing gaming, they'll be doing computational thinking in some form or another. And it's there to be used, it's there to be expanded upon. And I think I kind of want to always take a big enough step back to think about, why was maths and English so important when, in the industrial age, when that sort of education kind of became a mass thing. And of course, it's because before that, people didn't have any sort of experience of what that was. We wanted people to be able to count, to have some kind of mental numeracy and literacy,
Yep.
and so it was solving that problem, and it was really helping, and it gave people knowledge and important information which then helped them in their lives. And it seems if you start from that point, then you could start to think about how we could teach these things different now, like I say, based on this real world.
And that's exactly what we've tried to do with computerbasedmath.org over the last decade. And what my book is walking through in some detail. Bit too much detail for some people, not enough for others, but I tried to go a middle ground in that. And it's really, really hard. It's like saying, given that you're used to the 10 commandments, go rewrite the commandments. And because one's been infused with this all through one's life, as that, as you say, English, maths are important and they're sacrosanct to your education, it's very hard, even if you know them well, to step back and say, hang on, which bit of that did I really need and which bit didn't I need? Your point is a very interesting one about the sort of what was achieved in the last industrial revolution, I should say, with respect to education. And the idea that, let's remember back in, I suppose, the early 1800s, a comparison I've used quite often, which I think is interesting, is people thought mass literacy wasn't really a possibility. They thought, to put it bluntly, they thought most people were too stupid to learn to read and write. That there was a small band at the top end, so to speak, the sort of priests and aristocrats who could figure it out, and everybody else was kind of, that wouldn't work. Obviously, that's been proved dramatically wrong. And I think one of the, if you want to pick a real dramatic success of mass education, it is the idea of literacy for everyone, how that's moved, everybody's lives forward and also our economies forward at the same time. So I'm arguing that we're in a new era where, in a sense, computational literacy could be that new bedrock for everyone. But we haven't got it at the moment. We've got a few aficionados at the top end who kind of understand it and not others. And that's sort of where I'm hoping we may be able to go. And I think that this sort of maths for everyone, I believe there is a good case for that, but it's not the maths we're doing at the moment. And as you say, everyone, some years ago, the problem was that many people didn't really have access to the machinery. But they do now. As you say, between smartphones and tablets and laptops and everything else, certainly a country like the UK, most people have pretty good access, and it's not very hard financially to fill in where they don't. And so there's no reason not to use these things, but it's very hard to decide how to do it, and that's really what we've been trying to work on.
And it's interesting in the current climate, with Brexit and this idea of, what is the UK, what is England, how does it move forward, what's its identity related to its historical past and also its future. And one of the things I really liked when I was sort of really exploring this was the idea that we could be world leaders in actually just thinking about this and then adopting a way of going about it in the way that we would have been proud to have said something we did sort of historically. But yet there's so much comparison about what is the here and now with everyone else at the here and now, and it seems to me that sort of idea of groundbreaking future thought and how that's then implemented is something that everyone's scared of, and it seems to me that we're in a position now where we could really embrace this and take it on board.
Totally agree with that. Lots of interesting parts to that. One is the idea, unfortunately somebody told me in the UK actually, who was doing this was some years ago, that they'd been sent around the world to look at best practice in maths so Britain could lead. And they didn't quite see what was wrong with that concept. You're right. And in several ways, one of the aspects I argue about sometimes is that, if you look at sort of UK society style, sort of the slight edginess that is promoted often against, for example, some of the Asian cultures where it's, people are encouraged to be sort of more conformist. I think that the edginess is what we need, and is actually that. So in a sense, we need to tether things the other way round to some other cultures. In the sense that I think what you need to tether the edginess to is a process of computational thinking that allows you to take this sort of edginess and work lots of useful things out from that. Sort of help to, because the future of what humans need to do is they need to be coming up with the ideas which they can then sort of work jointly with computers on manifesting in a sense. So there's this kind of hybrid AI human intelligence that we're using. And if you want the human to be in control, then the human needs to be the sort of idea, it needs to do the higher level, more complex work in a sense. And that's what you need to have education prepare everyone for. Now, I actually think it's, in a sense, not exactly easier, but a, a shift that's more doable to move a typical Brit who's slightly edgy and maybe not the best at following a process to be able to use that computational thinking system than it is to take somebody in a very conformist culture and have them try to think out of the box in a very different way. And so I think that some of the PISA comparisons and things, which tend to favor some of those countries that do what I would call more procedural maths, I almost feel like we're playing on the wrong game on the wrong playing field, and it's like we have a chance to leapfrog some of the Singapores and Finlands and things who do very well at that in those tests, do something quite different that really keys into these strengths we have, thinking out of the box, being able to handle complexity, having really good ideas about new ways to proceed.
I couldn't agree more. And I think it's really interesting that the one thing we need for all of those things you've just mentioned are excited, enthusiastic students who want to be doing this. And so therefore creating an education system across the board is really important, that students and pupils understand that this is their world they're going into. It's their thoughts, it's their ideas that are important, and we can then show you the tools, the skills, and the sorts of experiences that we know now that you can then sort of take the baton, as it were, and go forward. So that even the concept of having a math lesson which is just completely shutting everybody down is like I say, the complete opposite of what we want. And I think having a broad curriculum so that people find where that kind of their interests lie, because then they'll find where they want to head in the sorts of things that they want to do, and all of these other academic subjects are going to come to the fore as well.
Yeah, one of the problems with maths particularly is that we start from the abstract. And so I mean, going back to the quadratic equation example, you're told go solve a quadratic equation, and after you've done that 30 times over, if you're very lucky, you might discover when you might actually use it. The problem with that is, there are a few folks, possibly me included, who found that quite amusing because we could kind of beat our friends at it and were better at it than French. Particularly in my case, I was absolutely hopeless at French, but and so it seemed more fun. But for most people, it's just like, what on earth has this got to do with anything? And if it doesn't seem fun either, it's like a real turnoff. So I think one of the important aspects of how we have to change maths and generally education is start from something that seems to relate to the student's life, preferably their life at that time, or perhaps their life in the future if they can see that ahead. And then use, as you correctly say, use maths and computing as a tool for helping them to solve some of those issues. So what we've done is build a lot of modules, for example, that start from questions like, am I normal? So a good teenage question, can maths help me with figuring out if I'm normal? Like foot size or height or whatever it is. And a bit later we have modules like, are girls better at maths? So it's a data science question. You get all the data. What does better mean? I mean, it's a good question. Maybe if they're smart, the girls and the boys can figure out different questions there, so they can game making sure that they come out with the best answers and so forth. There are more general topics like cause or correlation. We have there's an example that's often given. Countries with more chocolate consumption tend to have more Nobel Prizes. So does eating more chocolate cause more Nobel Prizes? Question. So there are many of these examples that really fit. I think, and one has to find different students obviously will have different interests. And so you want to have a whole set of these that will hopefully kick off an interest. And then you start to learn, where can mathematics actually help you? Because it's not everywhere. And when do you apply it? And then actually let's go out and learn some of the techniques as opposed to just talking about it in English, and find that the abstraction is really helpful in order to solve problems. But let's not start from that point, because then we lose most of the students as we go along. By the way, just on the point of where you can use maths, one of my criticisms of what's happened in this year is some of the modeling, for example, for COVID, I think overstated what could be predicted. So one of the aspects you learn, or you should be learning with mathematics, is where can I use computation to get answers, and where, frankly, the error is so big that I can't really predict very much at all. So and that isn't. It's funny in our culture now. I think if you look back 50 or 100 years ago, the idea that you could kind of work something out into the future as to, precisely what would happen was almost crazy. Now it's almost turned on its head. It's like if you can't, ministers, if you can't predict before the Brexit vote whether house prices are going to go up or down, then you must be lying and not telling us the truth. Well, the reality is you can't, because there are too many variables. You don't know what's going to happen. And so we have to be honest about that. And that ought to be part of the maths education people receive, but currently is not.
Absolutely, and also I know one of the other things you're passionate about is actually having it relevant to understanding how you can adapt it into real life situations sort of going forward, whether that's mortgages, interest rates, just things which are fundamental to your current stage if you're going to get a bank account, or your next stage as you start to get a job and buy a house or whatever that happens to be. And so I'm really interested to know your thoughts in terms of, let's assume that we're not going to change the entire education system this week, which is a shame, but that's kind of where we are. So how does the work that you're doing sort of help blend that, and that sort of how we start to morph it and actually enable the students that want to be thriving and taking these sorts of ideas forward, which I think most students that you'd speak to would be sort of, yes, let's get going with this, and as opposed to the reality check of what most schools find, which is that by the end of the year I need this student to have gone up this particular level so that we can get our more pupils next year for the funding, etc., etc.
Look, it's hard, as you say. The ultimate goal here is system change, but the ecosystem of education is very stuck, and it's extremely hard to change. And the sort of linchpin is assessments, which everybody is forced to get through. And so when the content of those is off base, it's really hard to sort of navigate around that. But I think there are a few things. In fact, in the appendices of my book, I give some ideas of what you can do as teachers and parents and things to sort of move forward. I mean, one thing I think maths teachers can do in schools right now is we have this sort of 4-step process to think about maths: define, abstract, compute, and interpret. And even if you're doing traditional maths, I think it's really helpful for students to get a much clearer picture in their head of where they are in the process, what they're doing, because I think it'll help them when the problems get harder. And we've got like a poster you can download and things, and I think it's quite useful just to be able to kind of stick that up and point to it. So that's just a very practical idea. We've put a few sort of online modules up for self-study around this computational thinking at the Wolfram University, Wolfram U, just as a sort of forerunner to get people interested. I would say they're in beta version at the moment. They're not fully refined, but I think they've got some rather interesting aspects and very different to maths or coding. Another question I sometimes get asked is, how does this fit with sort of coding curriculum and so forth? And there absolutely is a fit. I mean, personally, I would want to make maths and coding all one subject with computational thinking. But I think meanwhile, some of the coding curriculum could be steered towards some of these sort of maths directions. And in fact, we've added, for example, some Wolfram language examples to the Raspberry Pi site. So, and that's freely accessible whether you're on a Raspberry Pi or not. So what I would encourage, I think, parents and teachers and others to do is to have a look at some of our modules, just as a taster. We also have available, we also have a bigger set that one can get for a school or individually. See if you can find some place to slot those in. They're not going to, necessarily instantly improve exam results. So there's always a challenge with that, whether that's for some of the students who have a little bit of extra bandwidth, or whether that's trying to encourage students to get excited by the subject who you're not going to get their interest anyway otherwise. Those might be a few sort of spots to use. And obviously parents, if there's a chance to get your students, your children interested in some of these ideas, that would be great. And even I think one of the things with parents particularly is trying to sort of pick out sort of things in life to apply this sort of computational thinking process to. I have a few descriptions in my book. When my daughter was much younger, I used to have arguments about when you, for example, divided. We would have a piece of chocolate, and she would say dividing it in half was fair, and I would argue with her that wasn't true because I was bigger and so I needed more chocolate. And she would then argue back that that would make me grow in the wrong direction, and so therefore, actually, she needed it for her growth. So she would argue she would need more chocolate than I did, even though she was smaller, etc., etc. But to me, those are actually computational thinking skills. And wherever one can find places to slot those in as much as possible, that I think is really to be encouraged, so to speak.
And that's really, why this podcast actually exists. It's to have those kind of, it might not be we can do wholesale change in one fell swoop, but to understand where it is that you can find out this information, but to know that other people are, and that just the smallest change in your vocabulary or your just an idea or a short conversation with someone that just ignites that spark or just changes the whole idea of what the whole learning experience is, whether that's within certain confines that we'd like to change or not, actually can be the most valuable thing. And I think understanding that, and then of course knowing where you can go and find out more and showing what these examples are incredibly important.
I'd just like to add one small thing as well. In my book, I sort of launched a campaign called the MathsFix campaign for core computational curriculum change. And it's basically sort of 5 points that I suspect most people listening to this would agree with. The more people we can have sort of add their name to that, you'll find it on the MathsFix website. The kind of better, because what I'm trying to do is get as many people who agree with this as possible so that one can then start to push this system change as well. It won't do it by itself. But I think one of the aspects of this that's so frustrating is I think particularly most people in a country like the UK are pretty practical, pragmatic in the end. Most of them understand that they didn't like maths very much at school and that it probably without a computer isn't the right thing for the future. But our politicians are very scared of making a change because they think that it will be unpopular and difficult to sell. And, it's not going to be trivial. There'll be nasty headlines about it and so forth. I think the more that they can understand that with a bit of help and discussion, I think that most of the population this would be a huge win. It's actually one of the biggest policy wins you can do in education because it's sort of a point change, a big point change, but it is a point change, which I think most people would see as modern and taking us into the AI age, and as you say, having Britain as a leader rather than a follower. And so I really we're really trying to sort of, as well as pushing ideas on the ground to try, also trying to have as much voice as possible in public so that we can try and get this debate going.
I really love that. And I think, all of us have children at home or children that we're teaching that their time is now, and I think anything that we can do to kind of to sort of wave that flag or the piece of paper to say, look, this is what we are thinking collectively. And I think that's such an important point, is the fact that it's not about scarcity or worrying about being scared about it not being a vote winner. It's the fact that, like I say, if we could change that whole perception of actually this is a winner and why would you not, then it becomes a win-win. And you're absolutely right. A lot of these sort of policy changes come from what they think needs to happen or what they've seen and then jumping on the bandwagon. So it is these types of things and this bandwagon that's being created which is the most powerful thing.
And I should also add, whether one likes them or not, the current government are into data science, not necessarily for education, but they think that data science is important as a way to move the country forward. I'm not saying the other politicians aren't. I'm not sure there's any particular dissent from that in the UK political scene anyway at the moment. But I think that banner is a useful rallying cry as well for education, because it's pretty obvious that that's not happening in mainstream school education, and at some point it must become more and more obvious to more of the politicians and other people in government that those two really aren't aligned.
I think that's true, and I think and one of the things which is interesting for me is kind of how we impart some of this knowledge to the young people in our life in terms of we've got experience looking back, and also that kind of modelling idea. If we want things to be different, then we have to stand up and do those things different in order for that to change. And I think it's a bit of a two-way street there. So I'm quite interested to know what advice you would give your younger self now, sort of looking back in that particular kind of way. I know we have experience. I know younger people wouldn't necessarily even take that advice on board, but I think it's important for people to hear what that is, and then it can, like say, can go into the framework of how it expands in the future.
Well, let me say some very general advice, not particularly maths, which I guess I've learned, when I think back to school and so forth. Um, I mean, subjects and things I enjoyed that I really dug into have proved to be very helpful to me. One example, which I do remember strongly, was I managed to argue to do graphic design. I was the last year of O levels, so graphic design O levels before GCSEs, as opposed to taking more French. And I successfully managed to argue against rather a lot of resistance from my school to do that. And graphic design has been not only, I found it fun, and I got an A grade in it because I found it fun, but it was also it's been of enduring use. I mean, I've used it in my business career and things. I often help our design groups figure out what to do. So I think it's good to be able to, as much as possible, follow, and this is a message actually to parents as well as students, I should say. It's good to follow things that seem interesting, even if they don't seem the most important from a sort of, checkbox, I'm going to get into the best university point of view. And I think I'm seeing that increasingly with, in a sense, employees, people we hire, that, I mean, sure, I want to see what education they've got, but in the end, actually, it's more important whether they're interested in stuff, whether they can think clearly, et cetera, than whether they necessarily got the best grades and everything. Because I think the grades are diverging from some of the skills and interests we need. What else would I tell myself? I think probably worry a bit less about the immediate. I mean, it's hard to say this because, I did okay at my exams, although less good than I did in the school term, actually. But I got extremely concerned about the exams, as many, many people do now. I think the pressure now is much greater even than it was then. And so I think one message is, if you work hard and are sensible, in the end, it'll probably come right. Don't panic too much about the exams if you can try not to. But, do work hard. It's that you want to work hard, play hard, but don't get too stressed, because I think the stress in itself is bad and sort of is negatively reinforcing when you get into outer life. So I wish I could have learnt that a bit more. Stuff will typically be okay as long as you put your mind to it.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And one of the things that just struck me then is that it's our job, as the elders, as it were, whether you're a parent or a teacher, to kind of set that environment of kind of this is where you are, this is what you're doing. But I think when, almost from a curriculum point of view, like we were saying, when everything's real life related, then you can see how you step into that. And the exam, while it may still seem important and like you say, have anxiety attached to it, you can understand how it's part of your life. I think part of the issue that's coming from a mental health point of view at the moment is very much that kind of, it's all just about the exam. So your, many years
crazy.
at school just comes down to a 2-hour sit, as it were, and that
I know,
really
and
can't be the right thing.
And the thing is that's got much worse in my view is, I mean, look, I was in pretty high pressured schools and, and so forth, but there was more rounding to it. It was like, I mean, actually, one of the interesting things that's happened is, and I think this doesn't happen most places, as far as I understand. I always had which position I was in the set in the school, which is very against current thinking. Now, there was an actual advantage to that, funnily enough, because I then knew, as I said, that I was better at my term's work than I was at the exam. It was clear, it was there, I could tell. And so now I wouldn't necessarily know that in quite the same way, because you get kind of more effort marks and you don't really know where you are. And students will often feel like, so I know there are good reasons for why that isn't done. But I feel like there's a sort of, that puts more pressure on the one mark you do see, which is your exam grade in the end. And so that actually sort of makes that more of an issue in many ways. I mean, the other thing I would say is, I learned some of the most important aspects of what I learned were nothing to do with the curriculum. they were interesting teachers who had interesting things to say and would go off piste for one reason or another, or we would find ways to, bargain with them about when we had to do homework or whatever, skills that weren't specifically to do with the curriculum. And I think the more one can sort of hone into that, particularly with teachers that you think are interesting, the better. And I mean, again, it's such a pity that, and I understand why this has happened, but somehow it feels like at many schools, in fact all schools really, kind of what teachers are allowed to do has sort of got narrowed. Everything's much more controlled and collimated, and I get it. Some teachers did wrong things, and we want to avoid that. But on the other hand, we don't really want good teachers who have lots of exciting, interesting, eccentric things to say to kind of get pulled down to just having to do a very sort of collimated set of tasks. And I really hope that can sort of be unlocked a little bit as we go forwards.
Yeah, I really love that. And I think it all comes down again to, like you said, about the immediacy of your life, making it relevant to you. You can't have anything more relevant than the conversation you're having with the person in your class or your school. And like I say, you're not going to be great at every subject. You're not going to necessarily like every teacher, but you just lean into the ones that you do, and you lean into those conversations with the teachers that kind of get you and see you and all that kind of thing. And from there, you suddenly realize this is actually a two-way street in many ways. It's not just about just turning up, doing what you have to do, and then leaving at the end of the day.
And the thing is, in real life, people get annoyed sometimes, right? So it's like, well, teachers get annoyed sometimes. And of course there are limits on this, but you kind of want to see that emotion come through. You don't want it all kind of like, well, the rubric says you mustn't do this and the other. And then, because I mean, we used to enjoy, we used to know there was sometimes you could wind up a teacher and do this, that, and the other, and then they reacted. And I think that's all important aspect of learning about life, learning about how people interact. And I actually think it's a funny extra danger I've noticed to some extent when we employ younger people now, which is there are certain in-person sort of styles of communication that they're really not used to anymore at all. And because they're used to doing everything online. They're used to kind of pre-negotiating, meeting up online. They're pre-negotiating this and that online. And it's actually quite difficult. Sometimes when you get them in like an office environment or something, it can be quite hard for them to understand how you interact in a way like that. It's sort of bizarre. And so again, I think the more of that sort of interaction we can have in colleges and schools, the better, and encouraging people not always to be. I mean, I'm great about that. I'm part of the computer industry, so I'm all for some of the advances that have happened. But I think we need to be clear on where we need people to be. And actually, it's interesting in this year how much I've noticed in-person working has made a difference. So obviously we were all locked down in sort of March, and nobody was in our office or anything like that. And then in the summer we managed to get some folks back. It made a huge difference actually to be interacting in person. And it is interesting to see that. It's kind of one of those experiments that one doesn't get normally to try.
Absolutely, and I certainly noticed that for my children's experience was the fact that in some ways when they were learning online at home, there were some benefits to that. They quite liked the fact they could start slightly later because they hadn't quite got all the live lessons going, so it was kind of do the work set for the day. So the days were shorter because they could get the work done faster because there's a lot less time wasted in terms of being at school. And that worked in many ways. But then having gone back to school in September, I think the social interaction, the being with their friends, the working together and the collaboration has far outweighed that. And my daughter certainly has been off the last couple of weeks because there were teachers there weren't enough teachers in school to cover a lot of the things, so that they were sent home for a couple of weeks. And it was very interesting having had sort of the experience of that close proximity in terms of being off, being on, being off again. And really glad to get back again this week, just to be able to kind of really sort of get back into that familiarity.
Also, I think another aspect of that is the idea of time wasting versus not. So I know that certainly in terms of working in a company here, it's like people saying, well, my commute time is kind of great because I could sit at home and I could work all through my commute time. But actually the realizations come that the commute time isn't wasted. It's a sort of a reset period in a sense. And I feel the same about kids going to school and things. Sort of looking at it from an accounting point of view. There's an efficiency to be gained just sitting at home online, but somehow that isn't real. You gain efficiencies from changing scene, from moving about, from seeing people, from being in a different environment. And as you say, certainly in the long term, those completely outweigh the accounting efficiency.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, can we just wrap up by, can you give us where people can come and find out much more about you and, of course, the book and all the things you've got? Because I just think it's such an important factor, sort of rounding all of this part of the conversation up, that, like we said before, you can do small changes, you can do large changes. There's places that you can go and actually get wholesale expert advice and things. So tell us where people can go and find out more.
So if you go to computerbasedmath.org, is the summary of the change we're trying to make happen. There's a sister site called computationalthinking.org, which is more about sort of more generally computational thinking, not just at schools, but across different areas. But I think probably the first, the more relevant site for this. My book is actually part of in the computerbasedmath.org, but if you'll see it there, but it's also the mathsfix.org. And what I've tried to do in the book is walk through from, in a sense, got three parts. There's what's the problem, as part one. Part two is our specific proposal for how to fix it. What does the curriculum look like? What do the outcomes look like? How have we tried to construct these? What's in them? That sort of thing. And then the third part is how we make change. What are all the problems? Some of the things we've discussed today about where one can sort of poke to get a change, and why that really, really matters. And I talk about sort of a new enlightenment if we can get this right. A sort of computational enlightenment in the same way as we had some hundreds of years ago. So that's sort of the best place to look. And there are various sort of shorter pieces and longer pieces depending on how much detail one wants to go into. It's very complicated if you add it all up, but the idea is pretty simple, which is take modern machinery and use it in our schools in the way it's used in the outside world. And that's what we need for our AI age. And I'd be really, really keen to get as many of your listeners in to have a look at that and see what they think, and do send us messages and see how you can engage. That would be great.
Well, Conrad, thank you so much for your input and your insights and your wisdom on this. And what I love the most is always the fact that we know people are out there making a difference. We're not stuck. We've talked about we'd like some kind of system change, but it is possible. There are people leading the way as a guiding light, exactly as you're doing. So thank you very much for sharing that with us.
No, thanks. It was a really good conversation.
Thanks for listening to the Education on Fire podcast. For more information of each episode and to get in touch, go to educationonfire.com. Education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire.